Okay, gang, let's get started. And I understand that this panel is the last one between us and a bunch of good beer and wine. So we'll try to be very efficient. And the way I'm going to run the panel is I want to tee it up by revisiting this idea of smart philanthropy, which I talked about this morning. And using that as a backdrop, we will then have the three panelists give some background about what they've been doing and the way they think about smart philanthropy. And I want to use this as a time for all of us to dig deeper into this notion that we're putting forward. And if there are problems, let's talk about the problems. If it makes sense, let's talk about whether we can change it to have it make more sense or learn even deeper insights in this area. So just as a summary, what I have up here on the left side is essentially the way we think about the market for charity. We think of it as having three major players, with the government being one important player. We call people another one, but what we mean by that is corporations, foundations, and actual individual givers. It's the way we're thinking about it. Now, most of our work during the first 3 years has been with individuals rather than corporations or foundations, but I think the insights that we found can lend themselves to what's happening in those other parts of the sector as well. And then the 501c3s, of course, complete the market. Now, as I mentioned this morning, along the way in the last 3 years, what we've learned is a lot about the actual programs and the manner in which we think about whether the programs are working. I think this is a fundamental shortcoming in many cases, that we do not actually know with good scientific evidence whether our programs actually work. So that brings us to this area on the right-hand side called smart philanthropy, or the future of SPI. Now this morning what I talked about is what does it take? And I argued that these first two steps, defining outcome metrics, which is hard. Many times when you talk to 501c3s, it's very difficult for them to articulate exactly what are the metrics that we care about. And then after we articulate those, we think about how do we measure those outcomes. I think this has come under the rubric of effective altruism or effective philanthropy in the blogosphere and in other areas of philanthropy. Now what we're proposing is that we need to think hard before we actually roll out the program. We're arguing that you need to think about what are those metrics you want to measure, and then after you figure that out, you actually design the program in a way that will allow you efficient measurement of those metrics. And I pointed out two potential issues that I commonly see, whether it's in the charitable sector or the for-profit sector. And the first one is, a lot of times we think we have an adequate control group, but we actually don't. We don't really understand the correct counterfactual, if you will. Now, secondly, when we try to estimate the proper counterfactual or the proper control group, many times it's not a very powerful test. So here, we have to think about there probably will be some cost at this moment, because the sector just does not have the expertise to carry out, especially point number 3. And that's where I argued this is where academics can help. We academics are pretty cheap labor. Our major payment is we would like to write about the data that we gather. So we can write about academic papers, we can write books, we can write blogs, whatever. That's our payment. I'd say 99% of the cases, academics are not going out and being paid consulting fees. They're being paid with the actual data. Okay, now in step 4, I talked about a plan for your results. And we talked about, does it pass a benefit cost test, firstly? If you ranked your programs by the benefit cost ratio, are we channeling more of our future resources into the programs that seemingly work the best? Now, another aspect of how you use your results is, do you use those results to generate more funding for your programs? What we've learned in the last 3 years is that many sophisticated donors, many large donors, many corporate donors are beginning to think more deeply about return on investment. They are beginning to ask, what will my dollar do? What will the return on my dollar be? So besides making your programs better, another way to use these insights is to go to your donor pool and say, we've had outsiders test our programs. And what we find is that they really work effectively for Group X, for example. I talked about heterogeneity this morning. And we realize that it's not a disease, right? And it's curable, but we don't want to cure it because that's just a distribution of outcomes that comes with any particular program. So I think in the end, in phase one, we talked about what are the best ways to enlarge the charity pool, why do people give, et cetera. One keen way could be to show potential donors the ROI of our programs and that we're actually taking seriously measuring when our programs work, why they work, and if they fail, trying to make those programs better. And we're actually advertising our ROI figures. Okay, so that's the way I think about using number 4. So today, the way that we will run the panel is we will go one by one, and as you can see now, we don't have him up here, but Gabriel will be kind of phone a friend type of thing. We'll be putting his picture up here after this slide is done. They will begin with a summary of things that they've been thinking about. I've urged them to think about this notion of smart philanthropy and to push us on this notion and to actually push us to levels so we understand exactly what the sector needs in this area that we're calling smart philanthropy. Okay, and I will try to go out to you as soon as I can for questions today because I think our audience has just been exceptional in giving deep questions, and I think you can give better questions than what I can create. Okay, so I will probably go early to you for questions. So from there, let's start with Marguerite.
Great. Thank you, John. I've learned a lot today about natural field experiments. All kinds of terminology that really kind of runs around the periphery of the work that I do as a philanthropic advisor. And I want to talk a bit about what that work is. I think it might be relevant to the discussion, and also it helps give you helps you understand the perspective that I am approaching this. So I've been a philanthropic advisor for about 10 years now, and previously practiced law as an estate planning attorney, and then moved into financial services as a trust administrator. My work essentially is to help high net worth individuals achieve their charitable goals. And in some cases, that means helping them be more strategic and impactful with their giving, determining what giving vehicles are best for them, helping them develop mission statements, helping them establish a gift or grant review process that includes evaluation of their giving. In other cases, it means helping them engage the next generation of wealth holders, family members, or rerouting them back to mission, or helping them to negotiate a single or a large gift. I also work with nonprofit organizations, and I share the trends that I'm seeing when I'm sitting at the table with these high net worth individuals, and they're talking about what they like and what they don't like about the nonprofit sector or particular organizations. And also I assist nonprofits when they're thinking about risk management and board development, especially as it relates to empowering board members to actually go out and do the fundraising that's necessary. So as an advisor, I spend time talking mostly to clients about what their motivations are, what is the why of their giving. And sometimes they are not able to clearly articulate that. So most of the work really comes from helping them identify why they're giving. And then we set up plans for essentially answering the questions: why, when, how much, what, with whom, how, and to what end. And I think this whole notion of smart philanthropy really addresses that how and to what end. So the ROI of giving depending on the why they're giving in the first place, what that ROI is, or what measurement is used, can vary greatly. So various reasons for giving: stewardship, I want to make a difference. There's a family legacy of giving. I want my name in lights. I want my children to give, or I want to set an example for children so that they don't go to the dark side because I've given them everything that they need. And I still want them to be good people. There are a lot of intangibles that go into deciding their decisions. Some of it is based on things that can be measured. Many times, and this is not mutually exclusive, there are a lot of intangibles that can't be measured that's really guiding them to give. So I want to just give you an example. I work at Northern Trust, and we have a very high level of confidentiality. So I can't use client names, but I want to tell this one story, which for a lot of fundraisers I think would be very interesting and kind of shows the complexity around motivations. I worked with a client around in 2007 on the West Coast, and this gentleman had 3 granddaughters. And each of his granddaughters, I think their names began with A, was Amy and Agnes and Abigail. We'll just say that those were their names. And he loved his granddaughters. He called them his girls. And he had recently taken them to see March of the Penguins. And at that same time, he was working with a development director at the local Sea Aquarium, and she wanted him to make $1 million gift. And she was offering all kinds of things as incentives for him to make this gift. We'll put your name on the dolphin tank. We'll name our gift shop after your family. And none of these things really matter. But he happened to tell this development director, I took my girls to see March of the Penguins. They love penguins. And she said, if you write a check for $1 million, we'll name 3 of our penguins after your granddaughters. And he wrote the check. I think it's ingenious for many reasons, mainly because I, for one, can't tell penguins apart. And so they're always going to be there. Whenever they show up, they're 3, Amy and Abigail are going to be there. So, and I remember him calling me afterwards, and I could tell he had been crying. He was so elated. He told me about going to the aquarium and seeing his granddaughters pointing out these penguins, and he was really crying about it. He was so happy. That development director probably never would have thought of that this was his naming opportunity. So I mention that really just to underline the point that when we're talking about smart philanthropy, I don't know whether that experience can be measured at all, but that was what was leading him to make a pretty substantial gift. So I also want to say that in some cases, families just getting to the goal of giving is significant. And that those individuals that see themselves as stewards of wealth, in my opinion, and I don't know that there's been any studies around this, I think they are more likely to embrace this notion of smart philanthropy. If they're saying, the wealth that I have has been given to me, or I've made it myself, I see myself as a steward of that. So then my ROI might look very different than someone who has inherited that wealth. So, when I think about smart philanthropy and I think about, this is a good movement. It's really an evolution in philanthropy. There might be a reason to focus or to really kind of identify a group of philanthropists, and that's assuming that they identify as philanthropists, that really see their role in giving or their role in philanthropy as being a good steward, because they're the ones that are more likely to think of how are we going to measure success at the beginning of their giving. And also, too, there's been a lot of research, I know, on entrepreneurs and their ability and really the proclivity to give more, even more than individuals who inherit wealth. So more research around entrepreneurs and how they think about giving, because I think that therein lies where we might be able to make some inroads and get more philanthropists really thinking in this way of return on investment, et cetera. So I'll stop there. I have more to say on it, but I want to give time to the other panelists.
Okay, thank you very much, Marguerite. So Gabriel, would you like to go next?
Before I go, just a quick thank you to our hosts here. It's an absolutely beautiful day here in New York City, but it was not a beautiful night, and I could not get to Chicago, and so and so thank you to John and Swaroop for making this technological solution possible. It's a little bit of a kind of funny moment for me because as an undergraduate, I watched a lot of movies on the screen at Max Palevsky Cinema, and so I never thought I'd actually be there myself. So hello, everybody. I guess the last thing I'll say is, Marguerite, I think only penguins can tell each other apart. But I'm here actually not to talk about that, but the Clark Foundation, and just wanted to give you a quick overview of how the Clark Foundation sees its work and integrates science into that. And at the end of that, I'll tell you a very quick story about how ROI plays a role in that, and how we actually work with one grantee example to kind of make it a little bit more concrete, actually. And so I had a couple of slides here, but I can, this is, I'll just tell when to advance very, very quickly. But basically, at its core, the Clark Foundation works to invest in models that have the strongest empirical evidence. So third-party social science research of the kind that John is really talking about at the top of this panel. And the organizations in our portfolio are also selected to really embrace that evidence and embrace the fact that they have some sort of empirical evidence of their effectiveness, and integrate that into the improvement of their programs. And so our main role as a funder, as we see it, is really to scale up and help further build the evidence base of those programs, to be able to achieve greater impact through greater evidence, or greater impact through greater scale, et cetera. And part of this role, I'll talk about that just briefly, is to continue to monitor and track this to ensure outcomes continue to be met, which I think is really important in a role for continuing research along that. So I'll describe the process briefly and then wrap on one of our grantees, the Center for Employment Opportunities. So 3 levels of effectiveness. I'll go through this very quickly here. The top level we call proven effectiveness, and really is those grantees that have actually shown their effectiveness with a rigorous random control trial. So again, back to what John was opening with, that a counterfactual was identified, and a sample size was large enough to be able to find a statistically significant results for a theory of change that's well laid out by an organization. For demonstrated effectiveness, we're looking at high-quality comparison group, and so quasi-experimental evaluation findings, and then high apparent effectiveness is our way of saying an organization has very strong internal pre and post results that show that there's a high likelihood that they're seeing results through their work, but they can't actually pin that to a comparison, compare that to what would have happened otherwise. But they're well on the way. If you advance one more slide, I'll just say very quickly what we actually do to locate these organizations is a process that's been designed and refined over the past decade that we call our due diligence process. And so we select organizations to bring into our due diligence process and evaluate them with in-person interviews with the board, with the frontline staff, with management, with the participants themselves, with stakeholders in the community, et cetera, to really identify if they're a good fit for our portfolio, because we have so few slots. We work with a dozen to 20 grantees with multi-year, multi-million-dollar grants that are unrestricted in nature, and so it's a long selection process. But we try to do it very carefully with the grantees that we select, and are looking for their what we call compelling product, which is the theory of change that they've laid out, evidence of the effectiveness of their program, which I just talked about, their commitment internally of their leadership to evaluation and the strength of that leadership, their financial viability, operational viability, and then really compatibility with our working relationship. It's much like working with a private equity firm where there's a lot of involvement. We call it high engagement philanthropy in many cases, and organizations that are really willing to partner to advance their mission over a long period of time. But because I'd like to close on the example of the Center for Employment Opportunities, because I actually think it's one of the best examples that we have in our portfolio of being able to use research to improve, use research for return on investment, et cetera. And so the Center for Employment Opportunities several years ago, first of all, let me just say, they work with recently incarcerated individuals, and they help find them jobs as a foundation for their future, to not only find them employment and retain them in employment, but also to help them stay out of jail and reduce what we call recidivism, of course. And so they actually engaged in a 3-year randomized control trial conducted by one of our evaluation partners, MDRC, and it was called More Than a Job, and it found that CEO's program actually reduced recidivism by about 16 to 22%, and that impact was actually greatest on those recently released from prison and those that were most disadvantaged and at greatest risk for returning to prison. And so this is, of course, a fantastic finding, and actually based on these findings, the Vera Institute was able to estimate the program's total net benefit to taxpayers at about $41,000 per participant, but as high as $4,100 per participant, as high as $8,300 for someone who's recently released. And actually, most of these benefits came in the reduced criminal justice experience, which is one would expect. And in fact, actually, the Times Journal columnist Christoph said this initiative by the Center for Employment Opportunities more than paid for itself. Each $1 brought up to $3.85 in benefits. And that's the type of return on investment that actually allows the program to engage with some federal initiatives. I'll talk about that in just 1 minute, but the interesting thing that the evaluation did not find, and why I think CEO is such a great case and why I like talking about it, is if you remember at the top, I said that the Center for Employment Opportunities is really interested in helping people find jobs and helping people not return to jail. And what the research showed is that it helped people find jobs, or help people not return to jail, but not find jobs. And so what they did is they actually took a look at their program and bolstered those elements of the program that help people retain those jobs. And so they put in place a rapid rewards program. They put in place special staffers that were just dedicated to actually helping participants stay in the jobs that they actually were placed in, or if they had to move from that job, to find another one quickly and stay in that one. And so that type of program model adjustment, refinement coming from evaluation is the type of ongoing improvements that this type of work can actually see. Going back to the return on investment and just wrapping on this, I think the ROI results are really interesting because they helped the Center for Employment Opportunities really make the case for not only expanding to California and to Oklahoma, but also for the New York State Pay for Success program, where they were able to engage in the expansion of their program, engage in a randomized control trial with New York State, and if that's shown to actually reduce recidivism, they're able to access state dollars for that, and actually be able to make the case for other Pay for Success programs across the country. The results from that are still a little ways out, 2020, but their existing evaluation and their program refinements were able to actually lead to those additional funding opportunities in that type of loop that I think John really laid out for us in that slide at the beginning. So I'll wrap there, John, and turn it back to you.
Okay, Gabriel, thank you very much. We will now turn the floor over to Maria.
Yep. Great. Good afternoon. My name is Maria Kim. I have the honor of serving as the president and CEO of CARA here in Chicago. So to kind of anchor it back to what Gabriel was saying, you can think of CARA as a small CEO works. He was giving the example of Center for Employment Opportunities out in New York, and in California, we're kind of a mini version of that organization here in Chicago. And to tie back to what Marguerite was saying, she was talking about the high net worth investor that was interested in making sure the penguins were named after the 3 granddaughters. So I think what that reminds me of is the power of listening in these particular equations, that this is not just kind of the mechanic process of understanding the science of what makes people tick, but it's also being intuitive and empathic enough to understand the art of what compels people to give. Just the other night, I was sitting at a table of different potential investors, but honestly, I didn't know everyone in the room, and I happened to be seated at a table where once I could see his name tag, I realized I was sitting across from Gordon Siegel, who is the co-founder of Crate & Barrel. And I'm kind of a regular Jane, like I'm not, a fancy schmancy. And so once I realized that I was sitting across from Gordon, I got very nervous. And I realized I stopped listening because I was so paranoid about how I was going to impress Mr. Siegel with our mission. And I kind of checked myself through the course of the meal, realizing that if I just engage with him as a person, and if I understand like what is motivating him individually, my ability to connect with him will immensely improve, and thereby creates a space for just having a natural conversation about charity. So we're talking about the science of philanthropy today, but I just wanted to put a plug in for the art of philanthropy as well. And so how do we think about return on investment? Just to give some landscape numbers, this is what we're talking about in Chicago. There are 600,000 folks who live at or below the poverty level in the city of Chicago. Context for the poverty level, for those that don't know, the federal poverty level is $20,000 for a family of 4. What? So to live at or below the poverty level means to live in extreme poverty effectively in our city. 6,500 individuals in Chicago at any given time are homeless. They are living on the street, they are at risk of immediate homelessness, they're living in a transitional shelter, et cetera. It would take you, if you were making a minimum wage job, 82 hours a week, 52 weeks a year to afford an apartment in the city. 82 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. So just to give you a sense of the types of battles that those affected by poverty are up against, and we're trying to be an agent in the middle of that. So our job is to help folks get and keep good jobs, individuals affected by homelessness and poverty. We're like an intensive set of boot camps and small businesses or social enterprises that help folks build skills to re-enter the workforce. Gateway wages for folks going into employment are about $22,000 or $11 an hour. And at 1 year of employment, 72% of our students celebrate that first year on the job. And to contextualize that, that's about 22 points higher than what the Bureau of Labor Stats will report for the same industries that we serve. So this statistic I kind of want to sit on for a second, because I also think the intellectual imperative that nonprofits have to face is that we have to understand how to pass what I'll call the significant other test. So for example, when I came home and told my husband, hey, 72% was last year's number for our 1 year job retention, he was like, yeah, he's like, he gave me the so what look on his face. And I was ready to take the spaghetti that was sitting in front of him and throw it, at him, like, what is your problem? How can you not be celebrating that outcome? That's amazing. And what I realized with my husband was that I wasn't passing the significant other test. He had no context in which to appreciate why 72% was relevant. And his first question was, what happened to the other 28%? It's a logical question, but it would have been disproven or would have been unnecessary if he knew that 49.9% is actually what the national norm is. So being able to really contextualize data in a way that makes sense to your significant other, not your academic colleague, but your wife, friend, partner, spouse, et cetera, is absolutely an imperative for all of us in this work. And then finally, when we think about, what is a real metric for success it's not just about getting and keeping jobs, it's about transitioning folks so that we stop the transfer of poverty from one generation to the next. 83% as of last year of our students were in permanent housing at their first year of employment. So that means they started in a transitional living shelter, and by the end of that first year of employment, 83% had their name on a lease, their kids are back in their care, they're on the living room floor working on homework together as a family, and hopefully we're taking those first basic steps to stop the transfer of poverty from one generation to the next. And finally, the way that we really think about social return on investment in the aggregate is through this exhibit. So this is following individuals that we placed into permanent employment in 2010. And at the top line, we're looking at, well, what are we now contributing to society in terms of income tax dollars and social security? Also in terms of sales tax dollars that folks are spending because they're buying stuff now that they're in gainful employment. Most importantly, though, we look at what is society now saving as a result of an individual being gainfully employed. So that number is much larger. You could see that the aggregated impact of that is about $6 million over the course of 1 year, and that's the cumulative total of things like avoidance of rearrest costs, like what Gabriel was talking about when he talks about reduced recidivism, or folks that were on temporary assistance for needy families but no longer are once they're gainfully employed. Food stamps that are no longer needed when you're gainfully employed. No longer using the emergency room as your primary form of health care because you have benefits through your company. All of these social costs that we once incurred that are now avoided as a result of an individual being gainfully employed are aggregated in this total. We total that up and we look at it over a 5-year time horizon, discount to today's cash value, and divide by our operating costs to suggest that for every dollar invested into CARA, we believe about 5 3/4 of social cash value is produced over a 5-year time horizon. Now, I will disclose this is a study that was done by us and Deloitte. It wasn't done by a body of academics, and there are challenges. There are flies in the ointment as it relates to counterfactuals, as John alluded to in the beginning. Those are problems that we can fix. The most important thing, though, is that the use of a tool like this provokes a conversation with the other individual, with a prospective investor in your mission, and it just opens up the dialogue that this is not just about a charitable gift, but it's also about the notion of leverage and what kind of social return can we create with dollars that folks invest in our program.
Great. That's super. Thank you very much, Maria. So I think I will start the Q&A portion by throwing out a question for all of you, for the three of you. What do you think this sector will look like in 20 years?
This is where I may have to have a disclaimer that the views that I'm about to share are mine and not representative of Northern Trust. I do a lot of work and wrote a white paper on impact investing, and I'm really fascinated with the different types of legal entities that are forming benefit corporations. I'm also fascinated by how young, wealthy individuals are thinking about social benefit and how they consider the nonprofit sector to be quite cumbersome. And in my opinion, in 20 years now, leaving the tax scheme aside, I think there's going to be less of a distinction between the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector. I think that most of the ROI, the social ROI that's going to be happening might be with organizations that are not public charities. So in 20 years, that's how I see it. And preparing for that and really, again, thinking about what would be necessary for those donors who are really already there. It's almost as if the train has left the station. And the nonprofit sector, they're really kind of doing things to kind of catch up with that paradigm shift, really, I think is going to be interesting. I must say that the nonprofit sector, to the extent you can continue to be engaged with educating your donors about the work that you do, that you can't take for granted that they really are aware, even if they have been with you for years. I can't tell you how many times that I sit at a table and the family will say, so why are we giving to this organization that we've been giving to for 20 years? How is it different from this organization down the street? So that ongoing education that's necessary, it is necessary in order to ensure that 20 years from now, the work that you're doing and how you're doing it is still going to be relevant and impactful and known to those high net worth individuals.
Okay, thank you.
I think the way that I think about this, I'm drawn back to the way that we segment our donors. So at CARA, we have a pretty classic problem right now where our donor pyramid looks more like an Eiffel Tower. A lot of high net worth people all the way at the top, so it's pretty skinny up here, but then not a wide enough base at the bottom. And where we want to go is to more of a pyramid, right? So a more classic isosceles triangle where your donors are distributed. And in our movement to do that, we have classified our donors into different archetypes, the top two of which are called the established elite. So the high net worth individual, as you might recognize them today, that is more into arts and culture and getting their name on a building and the sense of agency towards an outcome, things like that. And then the second tier being called the socially minded new elite. Because what we're finding right now is there's this niche of emerging donors. I would put them somewhere in the category of mid-30s to 50, new entrepreneurs, the new wealth in Chicago, that are really about leveraging their money towards a social good and wanting to feel the difference that they're making in the world. And if that's the way that, you know, archetypes are kind of shifting over time, it helps us to think about what are their wants. Their wants are going to be wanting to make that kind of impact and see the kind of leverage, and maybe less or so in initiatives like arts and culture for at least this emerging generation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Gabe?
What I'd love to see actually happen in the next couple of decades. I think over the last decade and a half, we've seen a real strategic move to using strategic plans actually for planning the growth of organizations. And John, the folks of us up on stage had a kind of hearty discussion about how hard some of this work is that we're thinking about and we're laying out here. And actually what I've started to see is organizations start to create evaluation plans. So what can we measure now? What would we like to measure in the future? And how can we work ourselves towards the most rigorous evidence over time so we can attach ourselves to this to a real movement around evidence that's happening right now. And so I'd really like to see that kind of sophistication spread through the field, much like the tactic of using strategic plans to really understand what the next 3 to 5 years looks like. And I think part of that too is on the evaluation community to help come up with better tools to actually more quickly estimate impact. And part of that is, and more cheaply even, and part of that you pointed to the academic approach, but I think also part of that is better collecting administrative records, and so programs can actually access information about their participants in a much easier way, in a much quicker way, without investing in extremely large and more expensive evaluations that take a lot of years. Those will have their role to prove out models, but once you're doing that, like, what can you actually do to more quickly understand? Are you on track? Do you need to change something? Where do program refinements need to happen, et cetera? And so as I look into the future, I'd really love to see that type of sophistication be spread, more thoroughly throughout the sector, so more folks have access to these tools in an easier way.
Thank you very much. So this morning, I showed a time series of a 40-year period from 1971 to 2011 that showed over that entire period the share of individual gifts of money was about 2.1 to 2.4% of income, and it never got out of that tube. So in 20 years, where do you think that number will be? And how will we get there if you're going to say it's higher or lower? What are the changes that you foresee that will lead to changes in that very robust figure over that 40-year period?
It's tough. That's a mystery.
If you want to pass, that's fine. I can go to the audience for questions. You can think about it and answer at the end.
Maybe we should have the audience answer that question. Curious.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I might propose that a potential huge force that would affect that number, to answer that question, might be the decline of organized religion in the United States in the coming decades. So I don't know, in your day-to-day work, do you see any sort of change in wealthy individuals looking for new places to do social activism or anything like that?
Let's talk a little bit about religious giving, because in my data that I published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, I had data all the way back to 1929. And this was share of wallet that went to religious causes, and it was stable, just like the number I showed you over that 40-year period. It's amazing. But I'll let you guys go ahead and answer the second part of the question, which you'd say religion has changed from 1929 to 2011. I think it has in the U.S. But the data, the level of gifts had not. But go ahead.
Yeah. Do you want to go?
I have a favorite. Go ahead.
So, can you repeat your question again outside of the observation around religion?
I was just wondering about, the decline of organized religion, which really is only showing up in data in the last, say, 10 years.
Right.
Whether or not, if it were to continue, it might affect the overall landscape for nonprofit work, social service work in the United States.
Yeah, I do recall seeing something in Giving USA, I think the 2015 report, which is really reporting on 2014, that there's continues to be this tension between, or this decline in religious giving, but the fact that individuals might not be focused as much on their faith, I think there's still opportunities for them to be a part of some organized giving. They just are calling it something else, or it's a different group. It might not be because of an affiliation with a particular religion, but those individuals are still finding ways to give, just not through their church or their synagogue, et cetera.
And I would say the first thing that came to mind when John mentioned the 2% number is, I'm a cafeteria Catholic. Cafeteria Catholic means you kind of walk down the line and pick and choose the stuff that resonates with you and you say no to the rest of it. That's what I would describe myself. But having grown up that way, I just remember 10% tithing, 10% tithing. And I think the challenge that we face is this tension between having to give because you're supposed to versus feeling compelled to give because you want to. And when I tie it back to some of the sessions we've had this afternoon, it really resonated with me, the professors who reflected on lower income people wanting to be being attracted to communal messages. Like, together we can do this, together we can create this outcome. And I feel like there are not enough tools or easy ways for organizations like ours to enter into that space, to leverage that kind of community messaging that engages people, but those are the kinds of tools that would attract people that would otherwise be affiliated to a strong religious community to attach to a team environment or a collective environment for change.
Yeah, and not to be offensive to anyone, but there could be an argument that crowdfunding is just another way, or getting on board with causes or Facebook and coming around a certain cause, that really is what is drawing people together, making them feel like they're a part of a community. It is the glue that is really encouraging people in much the same way, and again, I don't want to overstep this, in much the same way that certain religious affiliations are doing and have done in the past.
Okay, I can take another question. Gabriel, do you want to fire away, and then we'll take another question?
I don't know if I can speak about the difference between religious and non-religious giving or increasing the level of giving, but I think that, with high net worth individuals and individuals in general, it's always just going to be multiple factors that encourage people to give. Certainly their own motivations, their relationships with others, relationships with the community, be it religious or not. And the to me, some of the interesting thing about integrating evidence into this is not necessarily replacing all of that, but it's actually being able to sort of work with all of that to actually show results as well along that type of giving. Obviously, I work for a philanthropy, so we're endowed, but certainly have been a fundraiser in the past and been and had similar experiences to my colleagues on the panel.
Right. Okay, so I'll go ahead to the next question.
Something that I'd like to hear addressed is the change in the government perspective, the government environment for providing services for people. In Illinois, particularly, my youth has been endangered, jeopardized, affected with a low-income heating assistance program. Other child care and Head Start programs are all kind of
I think twofold, quickly from the CARA perspective. One is revenue diversification is obviously very important. So in CARA's case, it's 11% of our gross revenue comes from the government, which helps to mitigate challenges during topsy-turvy times like the ones that we're in right now. But as a public service announcement, I just encountered an organization the other day called Donor Path here in the state of Illinois. And their objective is to, particularly in response to the budget crisis here, is to help organizations by giving them a virtual development team. And the development team is actually comprised of professionals who are either unemployed or underemployed, but have development expertise, who help to build campaigns, build strategy, help with outbound direct mail, and help right now with the urgent message of, because of where we're at with the state budget crisis, your giving is important, is even more important. And they provide those services for an exceptionally nominal cost, particularly for emerging organizations. So do check them out, Donor Path.
Jim, would you like to say something about your paper with Payne on this? How when you looked at government grants and how they changed and how charities responded to those changes in dollars that were sent to charities? Because I think your paper is an excellent one, and I think the best example of how academics have attempted to take on that question.
But what it does is frees up their time. It gives them to go back and do what they like. So the crowding out of so the government grant crowded out private donations, but not because the donors gave less in response to the grant, but because the charities themselves spent less effort raising money. So that's the bottom line for our study.
Super. And there was some heterogeneity, I think, across subsectors of charity, if I recall right. Is that right, that were kind of interesting differences across how people in different subsectors responded? I thought arts or education had some particular result.
So we have two papers. The first paper, we looked at the social services sector, and the other was the arts.
Right.
And we looked at the social services. We looked at these two sectors because they differ in the degrees to which they rely on government grants and on private donations. So social services rely very heavily on government grants, so they're not easily substitutable for private donations, whereas the arts rely less on government grants and more on private donations. So we got that there's much greater sensitivity when you weren't so reliant on the government grants.
Very good. Thank you. I know I put you on the spot, but that was excellent. I think that answered the question, and that's the empirical evidence in that spirit that economists at least have produced. Go ahead, sir.
I want to go a different way, since you began with emphasis on evaluation. Oh, don't yell when a microphone is moved here.
Don't yell when a microphone's with you.
Since you're all talking about the scientific measurement and evaluation, the harmful side effect I see of doing that is, and there's a lot that are well known, but the one I'm focusing on now is newer to me. Why innovate? If you come up with a new program, it will be many years before you can scientifically demonstrate that it's better than the old program. So I think those who want to go exclusively on evidence-based ought to be thinking about setting up an innovation fund for more experimental, non-evidence-based work.
Yeah, so I think it all depends, right? There are a lot of short-run outcomes that we care about. And in some cases, when we care about long-run outcomes, there are short-run indicators that if we can change those, they tend to be predictive of long-run changes as well, what I would call root behaviors. Think about education. But I think you're certainly right. I think you're certainly right that there are trade-offs when we measure, and some of those trade-offs we need to think hard about.
I'm not saying don't measure. I'm saying if you're going to measure, you have to deal with this effect.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Michael.
There's,
So to answer your question about the 2%, which has been pretty standard even before 1971, actually, I really don't know that that's going to ever change. I think there's a reason that it's there, but I don't know that we know what that reason is. But I would say this, I'm with Episcopal Charities and Community Services. We have 17 agencies who are choking to death on the Illinois trough right now. And we're loaning them a lot of money and trying to keep them healthy. But what's happening here is, I think without what you're doing, John, and without evidence-based results and evidence-based measurement of programs, new or old, that you will not have the new donors give you money, because that's how they're trained. That's where they're coming from today. So when I see in our business is, whether we're creating a new entity or whether we have an old entity, we better look really hard at it and see what's working and what's not working. And the best way to do that is with control groups and with a structured program to make it work, so that we can then show the donors who are giving us money that their money is actually being invested well, not just tell them it's being invested well. So.
Just want to make a response to that, and I agree with you. I think one of the things that I would recommend is that, and this is all anecdotal because I haven't counted the numbers, out of 100 philanthropists, you're going to have maybe 15 that are there already. The most of them really sometimes struggle with even being called a philanthropist. They don't necessarily refer to them that way. And they're then also struggling with the change in language where they're considering their charitable assets as investments. So I think there's still a lot of education. There's still a lot of change in mindset that needs to happen to get more individuals to the place where they are saying, yep, I've got to know what my dollars are doing. I mean, every dollar technically is an impact dollar, but defining impact and helping donors understand what impact they should be looking for, that's where the partnership with the nonprofit sector becomes so important.
so if I can chip in here as well, I think, on the last 2 points, back to the sort of why evaluate, I think that there definitely is a tension in between holding a program stable and evaluating it with a longer term evaluation, and then the type of innovation or rapid changes that, not even in developing a new program, but actually adapting a program to new states, new settings, new populations, et cetera. And I think that's one of the important things about the type of evaluation that's being done and the way that evaluation dollars are being spent, that help understand the core components of what work and what doesn't. And also, again, like I mentioned before, a greater use of administrative data to, once you have a good program, to be able to innovate with it and test very quickly whether it's working or whether it's not, will sort of free up some more of that, rather than just making something and then 5 years later you get to declare whether or not you can actually put it in evidence clearinghouse and make it available for greater scale up.
Go ahead.
John, yeah, so we've done the fundraising for the Philanthropy panel study for the last 15 years, and thank you to Templeton for stepping up just recently and paying for the next couple of years. But this 2% figure is, as an economist, it's astonishing in lots of ways how steady it has been, both as a percentage of GDP and as a percentage of personal income. And yet, when you look at the panel study, each generation gives less than their parents and grandparents, even after control for differences in income, wealth, and educational attainment. So that's a disconcerting pattern, and particularly when you look at the religious giving, what we see is if you don't attend mass mosque synagogue, you don't give to congregational organizations, and each generation is attending mass mosque synagogue at lower rates. So I think there is a trend there that is getting worse. Now, the good news is, so that's the bad news. The good news is that if each household just reallocated $5 a week, $5 a day of discretionary spending to philanthropy, that would double household giving overnight. So it's not like these 5 families have to do something super ordinary. If everybody just did a little, it is quite feasible. Why it doesn't happen, I don't know, but it is imponderable. And on the tithing, only 2.7% of households give over 10% or more of their income to religious organizations. So we're not doing that as a society. We talk a lot about it, but we don't do it.
You're really feeding into my Catholic guilt.
Yeah. I am also a cafeteria Catholic. Yeah, I agree.
And I see a Mormon in the house too, who's tithing. No, they don't. They always have excuses. Michael Ransom wrote a nice paper on that. They have a ton of excuses for why they don't give 10%. Chuck, go ahead. Ask Brent. He's in the room. You guys aren't giving all 10%. Chuck, go ahead.
Different speakers in between, but one thing about the outcomes, and maybe this gets a little bit about if the average household gives $5, the average person, and most nonprofits know that the average person out there actually doesn't care about outcomes, and if you talk about outcomes when you're soliciting, it actually suppresses response. It's wealthier donors that actually care about outcomes. In America, the wealthy are getting wealthier, and those people are coming up with very new ways to get engaged in their philanthropy and giving it to donor advised funds and coming up with their own strategies. And so I don't know how this is going to play out in the future. We're talking about the 2%, but things are definitely changing, in terms of how this works. And I think if we're going to engage with those wealthier donors, we are going to have to figure out outcomes, and because they're a very different set. But most people, most nonprofits actually won't talk about it in their solicitations because it's actually been shown to suppress response.
No, I agree with that. But I don't think the denominator is all people who give. I think what we want to think about is what fraction of dollars that are available is potential donors, what fraction actually cares about ROI?
Yeah, most, because most is from those wealthier donors.
A lot, right? Because
Yeah.
we know the 10% rule, et cetera. I think that's the right figure to talk about rather than the average person.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, most money is actually being donated by those wealthier donors, even though most donors are not those donors. So it's a real dichotomy.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could lend some insight into why return on investment, because it seems very logical that people would want their money to be used to the fullest extent. So why among high net worth individuals, the largest philanthropists, has it become such a top priority only recently, as opposed to 30 years ago?
I think a large part of that has to do with how the money was made. The number of entrepreneurs that are engaged in philanthropy has increased tremendously, and the amount and the peer pressure that happens. I also think the nonprofit sector has already changed how it's talking about its work as a way to distinguish itself from another organization, et cetera. But thinking about, and this might be something to, again, consider as a control group or something, thinking about whether there's a way to parse out those people who made the money because of some industry, or they're an entrepreneur, they started a business, et cetera, and how they think about ROI. It's just a natural extension. And then, now that I'm thinking about it, there's this whole movement of venture philanthropy that started about 25 years ago that I also think has really contributed to there being a change in language that's used and a change in mindset around thinking about how to measure impact.
Go
And
ahead.
I'll add to that. I think a lot of it is a change in the business climate and the change in the way that we actually talk about um, results in the world. I know that Jim Manzi's book Uncontrolled is getting a lot of traction about this and sort of describing the use of random control trials in a business context and thinking about it more for social policies and what works. But certainly as a fundraiser, I even saw it when I worked and lived in Seattle, and a number of our donors came from the tech startup or the base of technology companies and the way that they interpreted what change actually meant.
I am having trouble understanding philanthropy in general, and I think that the problem I'm having is because I don't have a sense of history. I come from Latin America, and philanthropy is almost non-existent in developing countries, and there is huge inequality. So, can be the very rich, get richer and being more generous. That doesn't usually happen around the world. So. I don't know, so a sense of history of what led the US to have this sector in the economy will be interesting to have. And from my perspective, which is just a view of somebody who reads articles, not necessarily having read specific books about this, from what I understand, Carnegie started all this. And basically, what the sense I get is that they were saying, well, we have two choices. We could be the ones, that is, the industrialists and the rich, to decide to how distribute the resources we have, or we can let government do that. And so, in a way, so I don't know if I'm totally off, but I have this sense that having a sense of history and what it leads the US to have this culture of philanthropy will be interesting to help us understand where this is going to. So that's all.
If you're interested, I can provide you with a short bibliography of books and articles on that. It's actually very interesting. And I see your point is well taken, that having that context is really important, especially when you're trying to understand where people are now when they're thinking of giving. So if you want to give me your card, or I'll give you my card. And
That's great. Go ahead.
So it's great to see more donors and more nonprofits use the ROI framework. But my impression is that the overwhelming majority of people doing that are doing so within a given cause. So, if you're trying to feed people, maybe you fund the charity that feeds more people with a given amount of dollars. But it seems like there's very few people who are comparing ROI across causes. So I'm curious if you agree with that characterization, and if you think that there's anything that we can do to encourage more of that mindset.
Meaning, does it create more leverage to give to this cause versus that cause? I think that is an accurate characterization of what's happening there. I don't think that there's any entities that are kind of standardizing across industry within our sector to say, what are the differences within ROI. In truth, the number of agencies that actually have an active ROI calculation is relatively finite in this country. I think the institution, from at least my work, but Gabriel would have more insight in this, that has done a lot of great work and framework on this process has been Red F in California. So if you check them out, they have whole spreadsheets and algorithms and calculations that they propose people use, but that's particularly in the lane of social enterprise and workforce. So again, directly inside a cause.
Yeah, I mean, the Red F is certainly a field leader in SROI. Jed Emerson started a lot of that that work, and I've had the privilege of working with him in the past. And I think there are definitely some great research firms out there that are really pushing it forward. I mentioned Barra earlier, but I know that the RAND Corporation is actually creating a database of shadow prices across multiple different fields. So it'll make it easier to estimate some of the ROI in different fields. I don't really know of anybody actually trying to make the case of, one field is a better place to put money versus another field. Certainly a lot of donors and a lot of foundations make that decision in terms of how they direct their funding, and then on top of that, try to decide where the most effective place to put their funding is. But that may change in the future.
Em, go ahead.
Hi, I'm curious. I'm from a nonprofit, and I'm very fortunate that we have, my leadership has provided a lot of support for research and evaluation. However, you also have colleagues who maybe don't necessarily have that same background and don't quite understand why they need to allocate the time to supporting these initiatives and supporting the development of evidence for the programs when they've got to run the program. So I'd be curious to hear your perspective on helping build that desire outside of the leadership level, outside of the research and evaluation departments, to other departments and nonprofits to help them understand why this is important.
Like intuitively, so for context, Kara has never had a third-party evaluation. If I think about Gabriel's framework, he had like proven and then something and then kind of perceived or something. I don't know. What was your third thing again, Gabriel?
It's called high apparent.
High apparent. I would call Kara.
It's foundation jargon. So
got it. High apparent. So I would call Kara a high apparent. We've never had an MDRC or a third-party evaluator come in and prove that the model actually works. We haven't gone through an RCT or anything like that. I would love to. I would love to have the resources to do that, but we haven't yet. But if your question is really how do you kind of create the appetite for that within an organization beyond leadership, I think the question that you want to ask your staff is, we can get really navel-gazy in this work, right? We all can kind of look at ourselves and be like, wow, we're doing great stuff. Look at all these people. This is amazing, and you can get all into it. But don't you want to pull up and don't you want to have somebody who has no stake in the game to say, you know what, you guys are amazing, and somebody that's not your mom to tell you that you're doing a great job. That's what I would ask the staff. And people that are really high-achieving, high-performing professionals in this work would want that. They would want like the validation, the rubber stamp from an external party to say, yep, you guys got it going on. That might be the question I would propose.
And I would suggest that having gone through a type of evaluation for your colleagues, that you share with them that it really wasn't so painful. That I think nonprofits talking to each other about the success that they've had of going through this evaluation and how it possibly has enhanced the size of the gifts that they receive because they're being more responsive to their donors, sharing those types of stories is what's going to help other nonprofits or help the sector move. And also, to the extent you did some evaluation and you can share that with the funder, you plant a seed with the funder so that they can say, oh, this is really wonderful. Maybe I can encourage by actually increasing the check that I write to other nonprofit organizations for them to have the same exercise.
I just add that I think there's a great case to be made around performance measurement with this. With evaluation, I think the case is very much what's just been laid out. It's show you're able to increase program sustainability by showing what you do works. But this idea of what makes it useful for each level of the organization, I think, is also really important. And so, that frontline staff worker that's actually working with a set of individuals, helping find them jobs, helping them be recognized for the type of work they're doing, placing people, retaining people, and what have you, I think is really important. Actually, just using that example of Center for Employment Opportunities before, they had a staffer there for a little while that really helped people understand how all of these things related and did this funny presentation where he showed spurious correlations by actually tracking the outcomes based on the boot size of each one of the participants, because they gave each participant boots when they enrolled, and said, well, this isn't necessarily why it's happening, but here it is correlated with the different staff that they're working with and the actual work that you're doing. So giving that information back to the folks that are working with the participants is just really can be a real great case.
Okay, super. I'm going to close the session. I want to thank the panelists. This was really wonderful. Thank you very much.